If the intended curriculum is like the thing that a curriculum developer or organization or company or whatever intends for people to learn or to do or engage with, a layer down from that is called the taught curriculum. So the taught curriculum is what teachers actually teach from the intended curriculum. Sometimes teachers will deviate just by monitoring and adjusting. Sometimes teachers will look at a curriculum and go, that's interesting, but I'd prefer to talk about A instead of B. Or the kids that I work with might not be interested in that particular topic, so how could I reframe these concepts and practices in a topic that they would be interested in? So when educational researchers are investigating a curriculum, like with a pre and a post to see, well, how well does this teach computer science concepts and practices, standards, or computational thinking, or computational literacies? What's often omitted from those publications and those discussions is, okay, well, how did the intended curriculum, what was designed and developed, how did that differ from what was actually taught? What was changed? Or was there a script and teachers were reading verbatim? Likely not. So we need to consider differences in how people teach things from how it was intended to be taught. Now, what is taught is different from the experience curriculum. So here's a quote from page 408 and 409. Quote, partially through Dewey's emphasis on experience, authors of Synoptic Text on Curriculum Development have hailed curriculum as an experiential process. Caswell and Campbell define curriculum as all the experiences children have under the guidance of teachers. And B. Smith, Stanley, and Shores call curriculum a sequence of potential experiences for the purpose of disciplining children and youth in group ways of thinking and acting. The curriculum is always, in every society, a reflection of what people think, feel, believe, and do. The enacted curriculum includes the intended and taught. Moreover, its complexity involves a combined impact of all contributors: teachers, students, parents, policymakers, subject matter, and milieus within schools. The experience curriculum expands attention to thoughts, meanings, and feelings of students as they encounter it, end quote. Okay, so now in our third layer, we have the intended curriculum, which is like what's designed or developed. We have the taught curriculum, which is like the variations and deviations that a teacher chooses to make, or unintentionally or willingly, from the intended curriculum. But then what is experienced by a student might be different in terms of how did their learning experience differ from their peers and from what was taught or intended. But then there's another layer deeper that is the embodied curriculum. So the embodied curriculum might be conceived of as like, well, what do students walk away with? What do they take away and hold on to? And oftentimes that's not necessarily the concepts and practices that were supposed to be emphasized or the standards that were written up on the board of here's your intended learning outcome. What a student actually walks away from is the embodied curriculum, which is a result from what they experienced, which is a result from what was taught, which is a result from what was intended to be taught. However, there's another type of venue to consider when it comes to curriculum, and that is hidden curriculum. So here's a quote from page 404. Quote, the idea that the structures of schooling teach much that is not included in the official curriculum is referred to by the term hidden curriculum, end quote. So a little bit further down on page 404, Schubert mentions that educators should, quote, look at hidden consequences of life in classrooms and shaping outlooks and attitudes. He showed that living in a crowd of age mates, learning to defer gratification, and learning one's place in a variety of pecking orders constitute indelible consequences of schooling, perhaps more powerful than intended subject matter, end quote. And a little bit further down, the author mentions a particular study that explored the, quote, hidden curricular messages about divergent meanings of success conveyed to students of different social classes. She found that lower class students are taught to follow rules, middle class students learn to give right answers, while professional class students are allowed to be creative as long as they do not challenge executive elites. And the latter learn that schools bestow upon them valuable credentials of the Ivy League variety that combine with their powerful connections and financial wherewithal to seal and deliver the continued dominance of their families, end quote. So I want to expand upon this idea of a hidden curriculum and specifically like the difference in class and what is taught. So as an example, one time I had a conversation with somebody who was describing a curriculum in a lower socioeconomic location. And the curriculum was very verbatim in terms of had worksheets where there were right and wrong answers. You had to follow a sequence of steps and everybody would end up with the same result in that. And this was for Scratch, which is intended to be expressive and creative and open. But what they were describing was a very closed structure. Everybody had to follow the rules, basically. The hidden curriculum of this aligns with what Schubert was just describing. They were using, unknowingly, I'm assuming, a deficit framing that urban kids in particular could not engage in creative expression. First, they need to learn how to follow the rules. Then maybe after they've kind of proven themselves, then maybe they can actually express themselves. That hidden curriculum, or deficit framing of a hidden curriculum in particular, is highly problematic and is something that we need to consider. What are the things that are not overtly taught through the intended curriculum, but are nevertheless embodied through the hidden curriculum? And these forms of curriculum differ from what Schubert describes as the tested curriculum. So here's a couple of questions that Schubert asks from page 410. Quote, what is tested and why? Who benefits from the testing? How does testing sort society into a variety of levels of opportunity? End quote. That last question in particular is really something to sit with. How does testing sort society into a variety of levels of opportunity? When we think of high-stakes testing, it's high stakes because we know that if you don't pass this test, that has an impact on what doors are open or closed for you down the road. It's almost like we're playing an educational roguelike, where if you make one mistake, it can have a cascading series of barriers or challenges that you would then have to overcome if you didn't make that mistake. For example, just not doing well on SATs or something. How will that impact whether or not you get into a college? And maybe the reason why you didn't do well in the SATs has absolutely nothing to do with your preparedness. Maybe you just had a death in the family. But college admissions don't know that. They just see the score. And Schubert points out that it tends to be policymakers who have this overemphasis on test scores, as they tend to have like a business mindset in terms of, well, this is the profit margin of curricular success. This curriculum is great because students scored this way on this thing. But again, that's just looking at the intended curriculum, not necessarily what is taught or what is embodied and experienced. So policymakers in some states are now going, well, we should have performance pay. So that way we can also evaluate what is taught, what is experienced, what is embodied. You could do that, but that gets into another category that Schubert mentions called the null curriculum. Here's a quote from page 410. Quote, this term refers to that which is minimized or excluded due to priority and budget, capacities for art, philosophy, psychology, health, commitment, imagination, empathy, dedication, resourcefulness, spirituality, kindness, integrity, and lifelong learning are often touted as valuable. Yet, widely used achievement tests measure none of them, so they are given short shrift, or no emphasis at all, especially in social contexts where students receive low scores due to poverty, racism, and oppression. Thus, one could argue that the testing industry is built upon a network of assumptions about inquiry that creates methodologies of control or colonization, thereby creating docile acceptance of the sorting machine, end quote. Going back to that little story that I mentioned of the person talking about, well, these urban students are unable to engage in creative uses of Scratch, they need to just follow the steps. Another thing that I hear is what Schubert just described as the null curriculum, is all of these other things that are often highly valued and whatnot, those things are often left out in those context because there's such an emphasis on following rules and coming up with the same solutions rather than actually engaging in a more holistic approach to learning that goes beyond just simply standards, concepts, and practices or content knowledge, and instead focuses on other areas of life. Like that list that Schubert mentioned. So the capacities for art, philosophy, psychology, health, commitment, imagination, empathy, dedication, resourcefulness, spirituality, kindness, integrity, and lifelong learning. So few of those are actually a part of intended curricula, which means they're likely not part of what is taught or what is experienced, and then therefore what is embodied. And most of those certainly are not a part of the tested curriculum. So oftentimes, what is omitted from a curriculum can be even more important than what is actually included in the intended curriculum. But that being said, having been a classroom educator and now curriculum developer and whatnot, I'm fully aware that you don't have enough time in the day for everything. You have to make design decisions, essentially, especially if you're trying to sell a curriculum to a large group of kids, which again goes back to, well, you don't have to do that. Learn more in that Rhizomatic Learning podcast that I mentioned with Katie, Catherine, and John. And there's a link to that in the show notes. All right, so one more area that Schubert mentions is the outside curriculum. So this is the curriculum that occurs outside of schools, whether it be through their community, families, homes, peer groups, workplaces, or even just like hobbies and avocations and whatnot. This excerpt of the CSK8 podcast is from episode number 126, and it's titled Contemporary Venues of Curriculum Inquiry.